So let's delve a little bit deeper into what can be suggested in regards to indirect suggestion. Again, stories, parables, metaphors. There are lots of different books out there, lots of different resources out there, ranging from poetry to literature that you're familiar with and the clients are familiar with. There are actually some books out there on metaphor and therapy. There's a book, it's called, let me grab it real quick off my bookshelf. It's called sometimes referred to as the Big Red Book. It's called The Handbook of Hypnotic Suggestions and Metaphors. You'll see it's a giant book. You'll see I've actually bookmarked one of the metaphors or stories that I probably used with a client at one point. Now, I will sometimes say this, again, as I'm giving suggestions. And you may hear me read from the pages of a book or even from a piece of paper. The reason why, of course, is simple. I want to make sure that I cover everything that's important to you today. So it's perfectly okay for me to literally read from a book. Now, I'm not going to do that with the whole hypnosis session, but I might do that with a parable, a story, a metaphor, a poem, or something else. Now, people say to me, how do you discover these things? Well, one of my favorite things is to go to the bookstore and go to the poetry section. One of my favorite things is, again, to look at literature and short stories. Sometimes I will go to Google and find things. I'll have a client, I don't know, let's say he's coming in for, fear of elevators, and I'll say, I'll type in, motivational stories to overcome fear, and you'll find stories all over the internet, short stories, teaching stories. William Bennett, our former education secretary, wrote a book that was teaching parables and stories. And so there are lots of different places to find indirect suggestions. The two places in therapy that really kind of come to my mind is Stephen Hayes' work in acceptance and commitment therapy. Stephen Hayes is a researcher at the University of Nevada. He's a clinical psychologist, and he's developed an approach called acceptance and commitment therapy. And acceptance and commitment therapy is predicated upon sharing metaphors in story form with clients. So you can actually go to YouTube and you can type in act therapy metaphor, and you'll actually find a lot of different metaphors that he has actually illustrated or that his students have actually illustrated and posted online, and they're great. There's a bus driver metaphor, and there's a stranger metaphor, and there's a tiger metaphor. Just lots of different ones that share therapeutic purposes that come from that tradition of ACT therapy. One of my other places, of course, is Milton Erickson, and the many books written by and about Milton Erickson that share metaphors and stories. So here is an example of an indirect suggestion that comes from an Ericksonian tradition. The idea for the story is based on something that Milton Erickson said. I must have had the same grandmother as Milton Erickson, and maybe you even had the same grandmother as me, but I've shared this metaphor or this story with many different clients who come to me in my office, really for a variety of different things. I think it applies to weight loss. I think it applies to self-care, stress management, physical healing. So this is a metaphor, a story that I frequently use. And the best way for me to share it with you is for me actually to guide you through it as if you were my client. And so go ahead and close your eyes now. Bring yourself to that place that we call hypnosis. You've had lots of practice by this point. Breathe in, breathe out. And with each breath, allow yourself to relax even further. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And of course, you may hear me reading from the pages of a book or from my notes. The reason, of course, is so that I can make sure I cover everything that's important for you today. And of course, if you need to adjust for comfort in your chair, that's perfectly okay. That will simply help you to relax even further. And this, as you know, is that resource state that we call hypnosis, that place where the mind is open to learning new things and creating new experiences. And you're doing perfect. Before I give you what are called direct suggestions, I want to share a story with you. A story about my grandmother. When I was a little kid, I would watch my grandmother grow her tomato garden every year. I remember probably being 7 or 8 or 9, and actually laying on the lawn next to her in the springtime as she tilled the soil, as she prepared the garden. And over the next couple of days, as the garden became ready, she would plant the seeds and water those seeds. And each day I would go to the garden and I would sit by the side of the tomato garden and I would begin to watch for the sprouts to come above the surface, and eventually they always did. And those sprouts would give way to the new vine that was growing. And that vine had leaves, and that vine had yellow flowers. And those yellow flowers would begin to fall away as a green small bulb would grow in the center, and that green bulb would become larger and larger. And over the days and over the weeks and over the months, those green bulbs would eventually turn yellow and then orange and then a brilliant red. And I remember in August of every year, my grandmother always would begin to harvest the tomatoes, and she would bring them into the house, and they were always so delicious, so perfect, exactly the way a tomato should be. She would slice them. She would sometimes put a little dill on them, or a little salt and pepper, and maybe a little bit of vinegar to counter the sweetness of those delicious tomatoes. One day near the end of the summer, though, maybe I was a little older, a little wiser, I was sitting outside of the garden at the end of the summer, and I was thinking to myself, these tomatoes never have to ask my grandmother, how much water from the sky should I drink? They never asked my grandmother, how much nutrition from the soil should I absorb? And yet each and every summer throughout my childhood, the soil would be tilled, the seeds would be planted. The flowers would bloom and the bulbs would ripen. And the outcome was the same. Delicious, perfect tomatoes from my grandmother's garden. Now this, of course, is an example of an indirect suggestion. It's a story, it's a metaphor. It's an example of how we can spur a person's subconscious mind into action by sharing something that has meaning and importance, and even something, of course, that many people relate to. And now it is time to open your eyes. It is time for this short demonstration to end. And so taking a breath, let that breath fill your lungs with air. Let that air bring oxygen to every cell of the body. And open the eyes, feeling fantastic. Open the eyes, feeling fantastic. So now, if we were going to continue on with the session, I would go into a transitional deepener, and then I would go into direct suggestion. But that is an example of a story, metaphor, parable that could be shared. Think to yourself, how could hearing that story relate to you? Okay, now, I don't tell that story to every client. It doesn't relate to everyone. But I tell that story to many clients, and it is something of value to them. Now, it can be very short as well. For many years, there was a plaque on my office wall, and it was in Polish, and it was actually translated into English underneath the Polish. I don't read Polish, but it's an old Polish poem. And so I literally have it on the wall so I could read it, even though it was so short, it was easy to memorize. And I would share this with clients. This was the entire duration of my indirect suggestion, and I would immediately go into the direct suggestion. So again, eyes closed, done the induction, done the deepener. Breathe in, breathe out. I've given my suggestions about this being the resource state. Here's my indirect suggestion. And as you continue to relax, I'm reminded of a poem. In fact, you may have noticed the words of the poem on the walls of my office, or perhaps not. Either way is fine. But the poem says, The stream said to the river, "You go quickly, I go slowly, but together we reach the sea." As you continue to relax, each breath, each number, relaxing further. 3, 2, 1, 0. All the way down now. Now again, because this is only a demonstration, open your eyes, alert, oriented, feeling fantastic. So there's an example of a very short indirect suggestion that comes from a poem. Again, one of my favorite poets was actually a mentor of mine in graduate school, Carol Croskery, and she wrote a book called The Purple Cow, and it's illustrated by an artist named Beth March. And I love poetry. I've written one poem. I'm not a poet. I've only written one. But here's a poem from her book. And this could be used as an indirect suggestion. As you continue to relax, eyes closed. I'm reminded of a poem by Carol Croskery called The Singer. I am not a singer, but I knew one once. She was but a child, a slip of a thing. Her voice was high and clear, with power enough to sail right through the morning mists. She was a vocal athlete. She managed her voice so without effort. One could hear her voice from one mountaintop to another with no strain at all. Though very young, she was an artist, shaping, coloring, and sculpting the notes and phrases as she sang. How musically she sang, with a sweetness I never heard before. She grew up and her voice matured, but I still carry the sweet flute-like tones within my mind. And as you continue to breathe in, each breath, each number, relaxing a bit further. 3, 2, 1, 0. And again, you can see how by sharing a poem, we are indirectly suggesting to the subconscious mind a learning that is valuable to it. Hypnosis is an effective tool. An indirect suggestion is an important part of that. And now it is time to reorient. So if your eyes are closed, open the eyes, feeling fantastic and ready for the rest of our videos. Open the eyes, feeling fantastic. By the way, you don't have to snap. I don't know. I do sometimes. Not too much, but I do. I've always said that a hypnotist needs to practice their snap. We're going to cover the problem of what if your client won't open their eyes later on in another video. But these are some examples of that process of creating indirect suggestion for the clients that we're working with.